For example, every event that occurs in human history sends a ripple effect through history, such that God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting it might not emerge until centuries from now, perhaps in another country. An illustration of this would be the so-called butterfly effect in contemporary physics. It's been shown that the fluttering of a butterfly's wings on a twig in West Africa can set in motion forces that will eventually produce a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. And yet no one watching that little butterfly on the branch could possibly predict such an outcome. These kinds of probability judgments are just beyond our capacity.
Really? Okay, we're going to get to the butterfly effect thing here in a second. Let's handle the very first part of what he's talking about here. So, you're trying to tell me that God is all-knowing, he's omnibenevolent, all-powerful, that God can't figure out a way to make the ripples ripple in similar ways to produce the same kind of effect in time. So, like, he's saying that, oh, well, we can't know what ripple effect this one particular event, this event of suffering or this event of evil has on this world, and it may be centuries later that some kind of good comes from it. Never mind the fact that he seems like he's just pushing it off as like, oh, don't worry about it. Something good is going to come about, by it. I just know that that's going to happen without actually having any kind of evidence to prove that that's going to happen. But you're trying to tell me that God is, at the same time, God is all-knowing, but also not knowing enough. So you're going to sit there and tell me that God, at the exact same time as being all-knowing, is also not smart enough to figure out some other configuration of events that would end up with ripples that end up accomplishing the thing that he wanted to accomplish? Seriously? If he's all-knowing, then it seems like he would be able to do that. Because I can guarantee you, any event in history that happens that eventually comes to fruition does not necessarily need suffering attached to it in order to accomplish it. You can get to that particular end by some other means that doesn't include whatever kind of evil or suffering that you have in mind. Him saying that you just simply can't know the probability of this works both ways, because he doesn't know the probability of an alternate solution that would accomplish the same thing with the suffering. We're not saying that you need to forego the good end result of things. We're saying that you can get to those results without causing suffering along the way. That's what we're saying. Now let's get to this butterfly effect thing, because that was supremely stupid right there. First of all, the butterfly effect is something in chaos theory, which is more of a mathematical model rather than something in contemporary physics. Although chaos theory is used in physics on occasion, chaos theory is more of a mathematical thing. That's why Ian Malcolm is a mathematician, not a physicist. But this whole butterfly causing a hurricane or tornado thing has a bit of a weird past. For one thing, Edward Norton Lawrence came up with this whole concept in order to explain chaos theory in simple terms. Ultimately, it's meant to convey that small changes in the inputs to some large complex system can have very large effects on the system. And so that's what it's meant to illustrate. Initially, Lawrence actually came up with a seagull causing a storm. Like a seagull flapping its wings causes a storm somehow because of the minute changes in the atmosphere or whatever. But he was convinced to make it a bit more poetic and go with butterfly and hurricane. Now, this is a far cry from it being proven by contemporary physics that butterflies cause hurricanes to cross the Atlantic. So no, Dr. Craig, maybe stick to your lane, because mathematics is definitely not fucking one of them. But that being said, small changes to the inputs could have very large effects on the outcomes of some large complex system. So could there be a good reason why some kind of evil or suffering ends up occurring in history in this large complex system we call reality? Sure. Good outcomes can be seen as happening, resulting from episodes of suffering or evil. But that doesn't mean that those outcomes are only arrived at through suffering and evil. That is the fatal flaw of Dr. Craig's argument here. He assumes that the only way to get to that outcome is through the suffering and evil that occurs, and God knows that. He's playing off of a perceived ignorance of mathematics and probabilities that we cannot make a probabilistic guess as to how likely it is some outcome can be achieved by suffering and by not suffering. It's just far too complex. We just simply don't know if one exists without the other. See, the thing is that when you're dealing with such a large set, even if it's a minute percent, like it's a very small probability, that still means that it's likely. And given the complex nature of reality, I can guarantee you that you can get from point A to point B without any suffering involved. But that's the beauty of working from the idea that God is all-knowing, God is perfect, because that sets up this entire situation. That sets up who is controlling all of this? Well, God is. Well, what are the properties of God? He's perfect. He's all-knowing. He's the smartest motherfucker alive. He knows all information. He also knows the future. He knows how our actions are going to affect his reality that he has created. Okay. Does that mean that he would be smart enough to figure out paths that don't include suffering? Well, considering that the probabilistic nature of paths with suffering versus paths without suffering is some non-zero amount, then yes, God should be able to find really quickly the path through all of that from point A to point B without suffering. He should be able to find that, pinpoint it, and cause it to happen. See, this is a problem that is only a problem because of how Christians have defined their God.
And similarly, when we see some instance of suffering and evil in the world, we are simply not in a position to say with any sort of confidence, God probably doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for permitting that to occur.
Well, so saying that God probably doesn't have a good reason for that to occur is different than saying the path that doesn't include suffering exists. If God is benevolent, then he should choose that path. That's contained, that whole idea is contained in the part that's omnibenevolent. And now again, what we're defining as suffering and evil and all this is the unnecessary suffering and evil that happens. The things that we in fact know happen today that don't really have any kind of good outcomes, that don't, have any purpose whatsoever. That would be the unnecessary evil that we're talking about. In the vast spectrum of different paths that can be taken in this reality, there exists a non-zero amount of paths that include this unnecessary evil and suffering, and paths that don't include that unnecessary evil and suffering. So, God being all-knowing and all-powerful, immediately, he would know the path needed to be taken in order for no suffering to occur. The fact that God doesn't choose to do that means that God is not omnibenevolent.